We also had some very creepy things happen. So for example, there's an IQ effect. There's an Ivy League effect, not necessarily here, but where we had a number of Ivy League schools where to get an Asperger's diagnosis, you had to have an IQ over 115. In the Midwest, to get an Asperger's diagnosis, you have to have an IQ over 80. Okay? We also have age effects. So if you're an irritable 7-year-old, you get an autism diagnosis. If you're an irritable 12-year-old in the same site, you suddenly start getting called Asperger's. So this is not, I mean, it's so confusing that it really does not seem like a worthwhile way to go about the diagnosis. I think we're quite aware that there may be losses, and we want to be careful. One is to specify that if someone already has an Asperger diagnosis, PDD-NOS, or autism, this is folded into the new autism spectrum diagnosis. We're not saying everybody's got to go back and get a new diagnosis. The idea is that this autism spectrum disorders includes those people. Secondly, I think for self-advocates, if someone prefers to identify themselves as Asperger's, that does mean something to them and to other people, and that's fine. No one is trying to take that away. And third, we really want to be careful to not de-emphasize the range of skills that represent ASD. And again, both within individuals and across individuals. All right, I'm going to do this really quickly, but next major change is consolidating into 2 domains. And the idea here is that nonverbal communication overlaps so much with social behavior that it makes no sense to say that a conversation is social, but eye contact during a conversation is nonverbal communication, or vice versa. So the items are not taken out, they're just redistributed so that stereotyped speech moves into a repetitive behavior, or monologues move into a repetitive behavior, whereas nonverbal social interaction moves into social communication. I think what's been confusing and particularly in the press, is that in order to better address wider age ranges and more skill levels, the way that social communication is defined is according to 3 general principles. But what's different about this than DSM-4 is the idea is that it's up to the clinician with information from a parent and observation to provide examples of these principles. So there's not a definitive list where you're in or out. You do have to have a behavior that falls under each of these categories. But it's up to the clinician to come up with these examples. And the point here is there's a non-exhaustive list of examples. So, and actually this is not right. I just realized my secretary cleaned this up and put the old slide in. It includes relationships and adjusting behavior to context. So the idea here is we're talking about things like eye contact, intonation, facial expression. In a 2-year-old, this may be a child who it's very hard to get the child to look at you, for example. But in a 30-year-old, this may just be somebody who is trying so hard to look at you that they don't avert their gaze as they walk toward you. So it can be something quite different that exemplifies the principle. In relationships, for a 2-year-old, we're not expecting a 2-year-old to have independent friendships. So in a 2-year-old, it may be a 2-year-old who doesn't recognize their mother's best friend, even though they've met her, hundreds of times, or doesn't respond to her as someone special, even though they do respond to their parent. In an adult, it may be somebody who's really struggling in a job to understand the difference between who's a colleague, who's a supervisor, who's a mentor, and how do I interact with these different people. Okay. The issue here is that if we take existing data sets, like the one from DSM-4, we don't have these examples because we didn't ask about them. So inevitably, we are going to underestimate who has ASD. This is going to require that clinicians make a little more effort They are going to have to get somewhat different information and ask, especially parents, about these things. You can't necessarily see all of these things in a 15-minute office visit in an examining room. But it is not intended, there's no intention to restrict things. It's just that if you take that old list, it's not going to match up. And that's deliberate in the sense that we are actually trying to expand this. All right, I'm trying to. Last general change is that there are now 4 categories of repetitive behaviors. So this has been also substantially expanded. Stereotyped speech is now included with motor movements and whole body movements and repetitive use of objects. We have a specific category that has to do with resistance to change, which was not in DSM-4. We have restricted and fixated interests, preoccupations, and then we have unusual reactions, hyper or hyposensitivity to the environment. So this is completely new. This was in long ago, was booted out, and is back in, and this is expanded. The issue here is that now you do have to, by history, have 2 of these things. Not at any given moment. Because again, the reality is we're worried that clinicians are going to get rushed and say, I didn't see him flap. He must not have autism. The point here is that somewhere in your history, and someone will have to ask someone who knows you, or ask the person themselves, you have to have 2 of these. And that's because most of us have 1. Most people have a history of something where they did some of this. So, okay, there is a new category. We really do not know how this is going to work. So a new category which is called social communication disorder, and that is for people that do not have any repetitive behaviors ever in their history. Okay? From the data that we have from thousands of kids, if you have careful interviews of families and observations, this is a very, very small number of people. That's our estimate. We actually had, in over 4,000 cases, we had 9 people who did not have repetitive behaviors. But that's with a careful interview and somebody setting eyes. Sometimes parents of really little kids do not recognize these behaviors. People don't know what's normal and what's not. And so this is a category that's intended to pick up people who truly have never had repetitive behaviors. What will happen? I don't know. And I honestly don't know what the answer is. What do we do? You know, it would be nice to be able to have an atypical category, but what people are worried about is what's happened with PDD-NOS. In some sites, PDD-NOS is diagnosed more often than any other disorder, and it's crazy to have a not otherwise specified be the most common example of a behavior. This just comes back to the point is that we're not saying biology isn't important. We're actually trying to say it's very important, but it needs to be dealt with separately because right now we do not have direct links. We don't have something that always causes autism and only causes autism. So we need to know those things in a separate way. Okay, and then the last thing, and I really will stop, the last thing is that all of DSM-5 requires dimensional ratings of severity. This was something we were really uncomfortable with. And it was the place where when we talked to self-advocates, they were the most unhappy. I mean, they were unhappy having things be rated in terms of severity, period. But this is not our decision. This is all of DSM-5. Our other concern was, and I think this has come up a number of times already, that somebody with ASD may be doing very well because they have a lot of support. You know, you may have somebody who's in a great workplace and has wonderful parents and things have gone really well and has a lot of support. We do not want people to lose support that is what is allowing them to do well.